I'm going to start with another question that I'm not really going to answer, but that comes up. We'll share a question that comes up over and over again as we vision, and that's, are we really ready? Tell us in this way towards building bioregional governance, because we know bioregional governance can seem like a real stretch. But remember, for original peoples, this is not a stretch. Just think back to the story that Karina was telling us. As Mateo showed us in that last poll, across generations, we've been indoctrinated to know and recognize corporate logos, and for the most part, functionally unknow and unrelate to the living world around us. Many of us have been disciplined to believe that we are separate from the land, separate from others, and separate from the living world. And this way of thinking drives the extractive economy. And even if we know this, we recognize there's still a psychological barrier that might keep us from living into a different type of governance. Since this session has been dedicated to discussing bioregional governance, what is the smallest scale of governance that we interact with daily? One of the smallest scale of governances that we interact with daily. Ourselves, right? Our body, mind, spirit as a whole. So we compassionately acknowledge that we all have different relationships with our bodies, and still it's our first home and our first place. Movements for queer and trans liberation, reproductive freedom, and disability justice, all primarily led by Black and brown women of color, femmes, and non-binary people, have laid the foundation and frontline praxis, or the interplay between theory and practice, of resisting and reclaiming our full selves against racist, ableist, white supremacist heteropatriarchy. As Carla shared earlier, knowledge of home is the best starting place for any line of inquiry. So how well do we know our first home, our ecosystem? And what does knowing our first home have to do with any psychological barriers that might keep us from propelling towards bioregional governance? What are the roots of our psychological barriers? And you know we like to get to the entangled roots of all things here. And since we're talking about territory, land, bioregions, we'll take a few minutes to talk about one colonial tool that disrupted our knowledge of home: mapping. Colonial mapping is used on our lands, and we're really familiar with it, right? To give shape to the physical world by instituting arbitrary boundaries that allowed for the damming of rivers, that disconnected many people from our languages, that discouraged or prohibited sharing and trading, essentially determining how and with whom we could build relationships. Mapping made European colonizers think they could control what they feared, and what they feared and did not know was our lands and our people. Mapping deliberately disrupted our knowledge of home, or ecology, our management of home, economies, by disconnecting our relationships to home, our ecosystems. This has, for the most part, endured through continued indoctrination of this globalized logic of control for the purposes of stealing and building wealth over the course of over 5 centuries, 500 plus years. This imposed cultural shift of disconnection had to happen at the scale of the human mind. So this means we were also mapped. Mapping imposes names, identities. It creates this hierarchical, imaginary world that is necessary to maintain white supremacy, heterosexism, ableism, gender binarism, all of which uphold the global extractive economy through racial capitalism. This way of thinking made it so that colonizers and settlers saw the land that we belong to as real estate and our bodies as a resource for labor. So if our body, mind, spirit is an ecosystem, then the colonial mapping of our body, mind, spirit has dammed up the waters in our bodies, right? Crying is seen as a weakness. That's what we're taught, right? That menstrual blood is hidden and it's a source of shame. It's disconnected us from our understanding of our own fire management, how we take care of our fire as our spirit to regulate our growth. It's controlled our wind, our ways of expression, our emotions, and place those within a hierarchy, right? Joy and happiness are acceptable emotions, while sadness, grief, and anger are not. And then our flesh, made of carbon, our earth. We've been taught that some bodies are good and some are bad. Some are deserving of life and some are not. There are parts of our bodies, of our own bodies, that are seen as bad or shameful. For some of us, it's our whole body. And we've also been made to believe that other people carry expertise about our bodies instead of collaborating with us on our unique knowledge of home. As movements, we've intentionally, righteously, and purposefully trained to keep our focus and energy at the macro scale of governance. And we've also been left with less time to plan and practice for what we will do at the micro scale, inside our home, inside ourself, when we do win. Our movement ancestors and elders in reflection have told us that we also need to transform our intra within us and interpersonal relationships. So just imagine what kind of ancestral knowledge and generational healing will activate as we remember our self-ecology together for the purposes of collective governance through care. As we get back into right relationship with the living world we are a part of, through building our ecological literacy, through knowing our body, mind, spirits deeply with trust, and simultaneously cultivating that knowing within our bioregional relationships within the collective. This also grows regenerative economies. It rebuilds community wealth based on sharing and caring, and moves us even closer to rematriation or restoring the sacred, and reparations, repairing relations. It has to be part of our strategy.